Three rangers disappear under mysterious circumstances. First, Eric Larson disappeared in the snow, leaving only perfect footprints that ended in the void. Then Eric Peterson reported silent figures and vanished, along with dozens of unfamiliar footprints that led nowhere. Then Sarah Newton, her service jeep with its headlights on, and the engine running, as if she had never been there. These cases are separated by years and hundreds of miles, but they have one thing in common. They are inexplicable, and every time the radios are left behind, turned on, no signal. What is happening in America's national parks, and why are rangers the first to disappear? February 1988 was an unusually snowy month for Yosemite National Park. At the beginning of the month, a powerful cyclone swept through the Sierra Nevada, dumping heavy snow on the mountain passes. The thickness of the fresh snow exceeded 5 feet in some places. For most tourists, the season was closed, but patrols of high-altitude areas continued. The Badger Pass area is one such place, deserted, difficult to access, but mandatory for inspection after snowfall due to the threat of avalanches and blocked trails. That day, the patrol was led by Eric William Larson, a 35-year-old ranger with 8 years of experience. His colleagues respected him for his reliability and calmness. He was one of those who consistently followed protocol. Tall and thin, with a habit of wearing 2 pairs of socks even in summer, he treated his job as a personal mission. The service base in Wavone received its last call at 11:14 a.m. He reported that he had reached the fork at the observation point. The snow was knee-deep. No avalanches had been spotted, and he was continuing along the route. He said this as usual, clearly without fuss, and did not come on the air again. When the duty officer tried to contact him at 1 p.m., there was no response. At first, they decided that he had simply gone into an area where the radio could not reach him. By 3 p.m., the alarm grew. There was stable coverage in the area where Larson was traveling, and he rarely broke his communication schedule. At 4:30 p.m., management decided to launch an urgent ground search. A team was quickly assembled, 2 rangers and an experienced rescuer, and they set off on snowmobiles along a well-trodden trail. An hour later, at 5:50 p.m., they were on site. At the edge of a clearing, next to a snow-covered trail, one of the rangers noticed a black radio lying directly on the snow. It was turned on. There were no signs of a fall or handprints on the case. It appeared to have been carefully placed on top of the snow. There were no other traces around it, only a transparent chain of Larson's boot prints leading toward the clearing. They ended abruptly in the middle of the snowy space, where there were no bushes, rocks, or patches of melted snow. The tracks led to the middle of the clearing and disappeared. It was at this point that Larson seemed to have fallen through the ground. There were no traces of his return, no displacement of snow, no signs of an avalanche. Investigators described the place as abnormally untouched, as if no one had ever been there. One of the rangers wrote in his report, "The snow looked fresh, as if it had fallen during the night, but there were only his tracks in it, and they disappeared in the center." There, 3 feet from the disappearance site, they found another detail. A small piece of fabric frozen into the snow. It was a piece of a uniform. The rest of the equipment was missing. The next day, a full-scale search began. More than 40 people, 5 snowmobiles, and 2 helicopters were involved. They searched an area with a radius of more than 2 miles. No signs of movement, struggle, or bodily injury were found. The condition of the snow was extraordinary. It was untouched even near the radio. The snow cover was solid and did not collapse, and according to meteorologists' calculations, it could not have hidden human tracks in such a short time. There had been no avalanches in the area since December. There were no signs of wildlife, except for the occasional fox tracks nearby. One of the weather station recordings captured a strange noise on the ranger's standard communication channel between 11:30 and 11:37, approximately immediately after Larson's last call. The recording was preserved on magnetic tape in the station's archives. The noise was described as jumping and muffled, with no voice or obvious modulation. Some employees heard it live and thought it was a glitch or wind interference. Later, experts from the communications service listened to the fragment. No one could say for sure what it was, The data on the anomalies in the frequency was sent to the archives. On the 5th day of the search, the Badger Pass area resembled a war zone. Helicopters made 6 flights a day, and rescuers combed through the snow with flags and probes. About 70 people were involved, including 3 professional climbers and 4 dog handlers. Despite intensive efforts, each day brought only disappointment. No new clues emerged. The only thing they managed to find was on the 4th day, 26 feet southeast of the disappearance site, when a rescuer stepped on something hard under a layer of packed snow. It turned out to be a piece of black plastic. It had Motorola markings on it, the same model as the service radio. But the one found on the first day had an intact casing. It was unclear whether it was a different device or part of unknown equipment. Later, when checking the serial numbers, it turned out that the fragment found did not belong to Larson. With each passing day, investigators had fewer and fewer rational explanations. Various theories were put forward, ranging from sudden disorientation and a fall into a ravine hidden by a crack to an animal attack. But none of them explained the main thing: why the tracks stopped in the middle of an open area, why there were no entry or exit points nearby, and where the body was. Even the most skeptical participants in the operation began to admit that something beyond standard logic had happened to Eric. Particular attention was drawn to a story told by park employee Phil Taylor on the 7th day of the search. He recalled a similar case that occurred in January 1976, also in the Badger Pass area. At that time, a skier from Sacramento who had set out on a solo trip went missing. His skis were found stuck in the snow at the start of the descent, but there was no trace of him beyond that point. His body was never found. The incident was filed away as an accident. Taylor admitted that he only remembered it after seeing how Larson's tracks disappeared so abruptly, as if cut by a knife. On the 9th day, the search was called off. The official reason was the worsening weather conditions and the danger of avalanches in the southern direction. The temperature began to drop sharply, and the forecast was already predicting minus 20 degrees at night. The operation was moved to a monitoring phase. Eric's parents were told that there was still a chance he could have reached a shelter or temporary refuge. However, he was already unofficially presumed dead. His mother, Karen Larson, refused to leave Yosemite and continued to search the area on her own until she became hypothermic 2 weeks later and was hospitalized. In the spring, when the snow began to melt, a second ground search was conducted. Surveyors and dog handlers re-examined the area where the ranger had disappeared. This time they were interested in the point where the tracks ended. Under a layer of snow, they found dense grass cover, with no cracks, burrows, or depressions. Spectral analysis of the snow and soil was conducted, but no abnormalities were detected. 8 months later, the case was officially closed as a disappearance under unclear circumstances. Larson's service badge remained in the park's archives as a memorial exhibit. His family never received an explanation. None of the theories — avalanche, sudden disorientation, fall, animal attack, or deliberate departure — received any confirmation. No piece of equipment except for the radio was found. Some former employees who left the service in the early 2000s later mentioned the case in private interviews. One of them, who wished to remain anonymous, said, "Such cases are not uncommon, but if you work in the park, you are taught not to ask questions that have no answer." The morning of July 9, 1997, began like dozens of others at the National Park Service headquarters in Bar Harbor. The weather was clear with a gentle coastal breeze and the usual briefing for rangers heading out on patrol. Among them was 34-year-old Eric Stephen Peterson, one of the park's most experienced employees, who knew the coastal trails of Acadia like the back of his hand. He was a man of few words, calm and reserved, but his colleagues respected him for that. Peterson was not prone to exaggeration, panic, or fantasy. Everything he reported was always true. That day he was scheduled to patrol the southeastern section of the park, including the trail to Otter Cliffs, a famous cliff overlooking the ocean that was popular with tourists. The weather was perfect, a windless morning, clear skies, and visibility for miles. Eric set out on his route at 8:45 a.m. He took his standard equipment with him: a radio, water, an observation log, and a pocket knife. He was wearing his ranger uniform and a light windbreaker. He was traveling light. Checking the route didn't require a tent or a large backpack. His signal was steady. At 9:38 a.m., he reported that he had reached the trailhead at Beechcroft Trail. At 10:21 a.m., he noted traces of a recent campfire outside the permitted area and left a warning. Everything was going according to plan. At approximately 11:05, he reported the following. "I see 3 people ahead. They are standing on the trail, facing me. No contact yet. I'll try to approach them." The message caused slight confusion. There weren't many visitors in the park on a weekday, and no one had reported any routes in that direction. But that was no reason to worry. A minute later, Eric was back on the line. "They're not responding. They're standing there silently. They don't seem to hear me. Very strange. The distance is about 100 feet. The dispatcher confirmed receipt and advised him to approach cautiously. 2 minutes passed. Silence on the air. At 11:09, Eric transmitted another message, this time his voice sounding tense. "1 second, sir." The signal was lost. Eric Stephen Peterson did not make contact again. The first group of rangers arrived at Peterson's possible location at 1:40 p.m., just over 2 hours later. They expected to find either the ranger himself or, at the very least, his tracks. Instead, they found his radio lying in the grass about 16 feet from the edge of the trail. There were no signs of a struggle, a fall, or panic. Peterson's footprints did lead to the cliff, but they suddenly ended on flat ground. They literally disappeared. However, there were other footprints nearby, numerous tracks from heavy hiking boots that crossed, looped, and also ended abruptly in roughly the same radius. The soil composition and moisture content made it easy to read the tracks at this time of year. A tracking expert with 20 years of experience, who was called in to help with the investigation, later stated, "It feels like 5 or 6 people were standing here, but they didn't leave by the trail. They just ceased to exist here. There are no traces of retreat, only arrival." At this stage, the investigation was already underway. Given the urgency and circumstances, the Hancock County Search and Rescue Team was called in, along with several volunteers from among former law enforcement personnel. Over the next 24 hours, the entire Otter Cliffs area, including adjacent trails, rock ledges, and coastal slopes, was combed. Observation tents were set up, and patrols were conducted around the clock. No bodies, equipment, or signs of a fall were found. On the third day, rescuers rappelled down the cliffs in the hope that Peterson might have fallen and lost consciousness. A search of the coastline yielded nothing. The area where the ranger disappeared became a complete mystery. The only thing left behind was his radio lying on the ground, and dozens of strange footprints leading nowhere. Rumors began to spread. One of the junior staff members on duty at the communications station that day reported anonymously that Eric's voice in his last message sounded as if he was barely breathing. According to him, there was a strange rustling sound in the air, like the faint murmur of water or a distant rumble. These details were not included in the official report. When the search was officially suspended 10 days later, one of the most inexplicable and disturbing records in the history of Acadia National Park remained in the report archives. However, Eric Peterson's disappearance did not fade into obscurity. Every few weeks, the area was searched again. In November of that year, the winter season began in the park, and rangers reduced the number of patrols on remote trails. The Otter Cliffs area was closed until spring, as were most of the coastal trails. Almost 3 months passed. In February 1998, precisely 121 days after Eric's disappearance, 3 tourists from New Hampshire arrived at the park. They planned to spend the night near the coastal cliffs, taking advantage of a brief warm spell. In the area of the western descent to the cliffs, they began to gather large stones to build a fire pit. One of the stones was unusually light and sank deep into the ground, revealing a hollow space beneath the roughly piled rocks. Inside was a piece of fabric. At first, the hikers thought it was the remains of someone's old gear, but when they dug a little deeper, they saw fragments of a rib, then a shin bone. Rangers were called to the scene. Forensic experts confirmed that these were the remains of Eric Stephen Peterson. His skull was shattered, but not as a result of a blow. According to the experts' conclusion, this was caused by prolonged pressure from stones. As it turned out, the entire skeleton of the ranger was found there in an unnatural position, bent and seemingly compressed. The strangeness lay elsewhere. On the outside of the skull and ribs were minor cut marks, as if they had been scratched by a multitude of sharp objects. None of them was deep enough to be fatal, but there were many of them, more than 200 all over the skeleton. It did not appear to be the work of an animal. Also, on one of the remaining fragments of the mold, there were traces of old dirt. Still, it was a strange bluish color with an unusual mineral composition. Analysis could not determine its origin with certainty. The subsequent discovery only made matters worse. 65 feet from where the bones were found, under the roots of an old fallen tree, another anomaly was discovered. A trampled area with hundreds of intersecting shoe prints leading from nowhere to nowhere. Laboratory tests later showed that some of the footprints did indeed match the shape and size of military boots from the 1960s. The rest were more modern, but without clear patterns. There were no reports of group movements on any of the nearby trails on the day of Eric's disappearance. Moreover, according to the archives for July 1997, only 2 tourists officially registered to spend the night in the southern zone, and both chose to stay on the other side of the park. The cameras at the entrance did not record any large groups. So where did the dozens of pairs of footprints come from? Rumors began to spread among the rangers. According to unconfirmed reports, a senior officer who wished to remain anonymous claimed that such observing figures had appeared in the area before. Still, they were not mentioned in the reports, only passed on verbally from one shift to the next. The essence of the stories was always the same. People stood by the trail, silent, motionless, often with their backs or sides turned. They did not respond or move, as if they were not living beings. One such story was recorded as early as 1982. Still, at the time, it was dismissed as the hallucinations of a newcomer. According to official data, the FBI did not participate in the investigation. However, a closed copy of the report was found in the park security archives, which were inaccessible to the internal database. After that, several routes in the Otter Cliffs area began to be patrolled by 2 employees at a time, and the number of lone patrols was significantly reduced. The case of Eric Peterson's disappearance and death is still officially listed as an accident with unknown circumstances. Despite the discovery of his remains, his family has not received a full explanation. The main question remains unanswered. Who were the people Eric saw on the trail? And why did the tracks lead to nowhere? Information about this case is periodically removed from local news. Some details have only come to light thanks to independent researchers. But the official version remains the same. The ranger died in an accident. In the spring of 1998, a new patrol shift arrived at Acadia National Park. The route through Otter Cliffs was restored, but in a modified form. The section where Eric's body was found was excluded from the main trails. New employees were not directly prohibited from going there. Still, during briefings, they were instructed not to linger in the area of the cliff and to always report any anomalies. Several young rangers were surprised at how detailed the instructions on using the radio were, including rules for what to do if no one answers on the other end, but the reception is normal. Against this backdrop of caution, internal information began to leak out. One of the temporary employees, who had only been working in the park for a few months, later wrote in a private blog that while patrolling Otter Cliffs, he came across a group of tourists standing with their backs to the cliff. He said hello, but received no response. The people did not move. As he approached, he felt a strange chill, even though it was July. He then, according to his account, backed away, climbed a hill, and looked back at the site, but it was empty. There was no one there. Such accounts were never officially recorded, but these stories continued to circulate among employees. Many recalled an incident in 1983 when a school group on an excursion to the cliff suddenly discovered a man standing at the edge who did not respond and suddenly disappeared. The incident was not reported at the time either. Perhaps that is why the death of Eric Stephen Peterson became so high profile. It was too real to be ignored. An interesting twist occurred in 2002 when a research team working on National Park archives dug up some old records. In one of the 1976 journals, a report was found stating that on the route near Otter Cliffs, there had been reports of people standing silently by a tree for 4 consecutive days. No one questioned them, and soon after, all mentions of them disappeared. Since then, there have been no official reports of disappearances in the Otter Cliffs area. Internet forums dedicated to disappearances in national parks continue to discuss the case. Some researchers point to coincidences, cases where witnesses report groups of silent people suddenly disappearing, leaving no traces and no trail. It remains unknown what exactly Eric Peterson saw on the trail that July day. Were they ordinary tourists, a mysterious mental state, or something else entirely? But since then, most rangers working in those areas have adhered to one simple rule: if you see a figure standing silently at the edge, don't approach, ever. Sarah Elizabeth Newton, a 30-year-old National Park Service employee, was considered one of the most reliable and disciplined rangers assigned to the eastern part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. A native of Knoxville, Tennessee, she had been working in the park for 6 years, patrolling remote areas along gravel forest roads, checking trails, observing wildlife, and reporting fire hazards. She was known as someone who never deviated from her schedule, never ignored her radio, and indeed never abandoned her equipment without reason. That is what made her disappearance in October 1994 so alarming. On Saturday, October 9th, Sarah set out on a solo patrol along Indian Gap Road. This old country road runs through a densely wooded area between Newfound Gap and Cherokee Orchard. She was driving a green Ford Bronco service Jeep with department license plates and equipment inside. Radio contact was maintained until 3 p.m. She checked in twice, reporting that everything was fine. The last message came in at 3:14 p.m. Sarah mentioned that she had turned onto a side road to check an old parking lot by a creek. When she didn't report in by 4:30 p.m., dispatch didn't raise the alarm at first. There had been delays due to poor signal reception in the past. But by 6 p.m., when Sarah had not returned to base and was not responding to repeated calls, her partner on duty, Douglas Lane, began his own search along the presumed patrol route. At around 7 p.m., he found the service Jeep on an unnamed forest road in an area known locally as Colville Ridge, a narrow, winding road with dense vegetation and steep slopes on both sides. The car was parked at a bend, the headlights were on, and the engine was running. The driver's door was ajar. Neither Sarah nor any signs of her presence were to be found anywhere. There were no signs of an accident, a struggle, or tire tracks from other vehicles or footprints, except those left by the SUV's tires. Inside, the duty log was open and the radio was in place and working. Sarah's shoes, documents, cap, and jacket were all in the car. The trunk was closed and contained a first aid kit, a supply of water, and a set of tow ropes. A call to the Park Service prompted the emergency deployment of a search party within 40 minutes. The first wave of rangers arrived at the scene at 7:40 p.m. with flashlights and dogs. Strangely, the dogs refused to follow the trail from the car. They sniffed the seat and the ground near the doors, but did not detect any scent. That night, a light breeze blew, with no precipitation, and the temperature was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. A search of the surrounding area yielded nothing. Sarah seemed to have vanished into thin air. She didn't even leave a footprint. The next morning, air support and volunteers joined the operation. They combed more than 5 square miles in a radius from the point where the Jeep was found. No signal, no clothing, no scraps of fabric, no blood, no hair. There were no traces of the missing woman in the ditch, the stream, or the bushes. One of the investigators said in his report, "We found no evidence that she left the car on foot." It was precisely this inability to reconstruct the last seconds of her presence that gave rise not just to alarm within the team, but also a strange, oppressive feeling. The Jeep was running as if she had stepped out for a second and never returned. But then, where could she have gone in a matter of seconds without leaving even a footprint on the damp, soft ground? In the days that followed, the area around Colville Ridge turned into a coordination camp. Dog handlers, rangers, Military volunteers and firefighters were all working there. A helicopter flew along the forest border from Newfound Gap to Tri-Mountain Ridge, circling along the ridge. But even from the air, the area showed nothing suspicious. No broken trees, no traces of a fire, no bright spots of clothing. Sarah disappeared literally dozens of steps from the car, which was running and lit, in the middle of the road, where even at noon a rare animal would dare to approach. Her brother, Jeremy Newton, a former Marine, arrived that evening and immediately joined the search. He claimed to know Sarah's habits well and did not believe it was an accident. He followed the streams, descended into the lowlands, climbed along the cliff line, anywhere where it would be possible to slip or hide, even by accident. He was the first to notice two strange details that were not included in the official report. First, about 190 feet from the car, he found an area with a long indentation in the grass, as if someone had dragged a long, heavy object, like a backpack or a body, across the ground. But this area began and ended in the woods, with no clear traces. Photographs were taken, but they were not included in the case file. Secondly, he noticed that one of the plastic water bottles from the car had been cut on the side, as if with a knife. No fingerprints were found on it. By the 11th day of the search, the area was cordoned off. The official version: possible criminal involvement or a security threat. In an unofficial correspondence, one of the investigators wrote, "The area is like a trap. Everything leads back to the car, but nothing leads away from it." 3 weeks after her disappearance, 3 miles to the south, a group of local hunters discovered a strange trail. In the damp earth near a dry creek bed, there was a single distinct footprint, a woman's boot, the same size as the one Sarah wore. The problem was that the boot was turned toe down on the slope toward the stream, and there were no second prints or skid marks nearby. It was as if she had been standing on the edge and had disappeared without taking a second step. After that, the investigation had no working hypotheses left. The body, clothes, weapon, everything was gone. No animal attack, no accident, no voluntary departure. Everything remained in place except the person. A year later, in November 1995, one of the senior rangers, William Crawford, who had retired, gave an anonymous interview to a local radio host. He claimed that there had been 3 reported disappearances in the Colville Ridge area over the past 30 years. One was a boy from the camp in the 1970s. The second was a fisherman in the early 1980s. None of them were ever found. He also said that in 1991, 5 dead raccoons were found 2 miles east of this area, lying within a 50-foot radius, with no visible injuries. It was decided at the time that they had been poisoned, but veterinary analysis showed no toxins. Their lungs were as if they had collapsed, as if after a sudden decompression. No one directly linked this episode to the disappearances, but it was mentioned in official reports. Sarah was never found. Neither her body, nor her personal belongings, nor her bones, nor her clothes appeared a year later or 10 years later. Her case remains open to this day, and in the official archives of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Rangers, there is a separate note on her file. No physical explanation for her disappearance. To this day, new recruits going out on patrol in the area are instructed to maintain radio contact every 15 minutes. Do not stop the car without a reason, and always go out on patrol in pairs. Sarah Newton is not just a missing employee. Her case is the line beyond which even experienced rangers stop making logical conclusions. If you found this interesting, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon. This will help us continue to release videos like this. Write in the comments which story you find the most mysterious and what you think is happening in these places. Take care of yourselves, and we look forward to seeing you in our subsequent investigations. In the wildest corners of America, where glaciers, canyons, and dense forests hold their secrets, even those who know these lands like the back of their hand disappear. Brendan Jackson, a ranger in the Adirondack Mountains, vanished into the silence of Duck Hole, leaving behind only an empty tent and unanswered questions. Benjamin Drake vanished near the Swift Current Glacier in Glacier National Park, leaving only his cap on an inaccessible rock. Paul Harris stepped behind a boulder in Zion Canyon and disappeared without a trace. These rangers, guardians of the wilderness, have become part of its greatest mysteries. What secrets do these places hold, and why do even experienced trackers vanish as if nature itself has erased them? On the evening of Saturday, June 7, 2025, silence descended on Duck Hollow in the western part of the High Peaks Wilderness in the Adirondack Mountains. Located several miles from the nearest road, this place is the epitome of wilderness, a remote, rugged landscape marked by the remains of an old dam destroyed by Hurricane Irene and surrounded by the peaks of Mount Macanthan and Mount Sananoni. In early June, the nights are still cool and the days are moderately warm, creating the perfect conditions for solitude in the wilderness. At 7:22 p.m. local time, the crackle of a radio broke the silence. The calm voice of 42-year-old Assistant Forest Ranger Brendan Jackson came over the airwaves as he contacted the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Central Dispatch Center in Ray Brook. He reported his location, a camp in Duck Hole, and ended his workday. It was standard procedure, a routine act for a ranger on a multi-day assignment deep in the woods. After that message, the air went silent again. But the silence that followed was not just the peaceful quiet of the wilderness. It was an emptiness that went unnoticed. The main question arises, how could a man so deeply connected to this wilderness and an integral part of the system created to protect it simply disappear from official radar for 8 whole days? To understand the full depth of the tragedy, one must understand who Brendan Jackson was. He was not just a ranger. He was a historian, guide, and guardian of the wilderness in the digital age, whose loss resonated deeply in the hearts of many communities. Brendan Joseph Jackson was born in Albany and graduated from Central High School in Bethlehem. His academic path reflected his dual interests in technology and nature. He earned a degree in mechanical engineering from the Rochester Institute of Technology, followed by a bachelor's degree in forestry from Paul Smith's College, and a master's degree in forest resource management from SUNY's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. It was at Paul Smith's College that his passion for nature truly blossomed. He became a leader in the outdoor club, organizing hikes and expeditions that toughened his character and deepened his knowledge of the Adirondack wilderness. In 2008, Jackson began his career with the DEC as a seasonal forest ranger assistant, a role he returned to each year. He also worked as a caretaker at remote posts at Lake Colden and Marcy Dam in the heart of the High Peaks. His dedication was evident in his work. He participated in numerous rescue operations, helping lost, sick, and injured hikers, demonstrating calmness and competence in the most challenging situations. One of Jackson's most unique traits was his active online presence under the pseudonym D. Sethar on platforms such as ADK Forum and Reddit. He was not just a participant but a true authority, a celebrity in the forest, as some called him. His posts were known for their kindness, wisdom, and incredible detail. He shared his extensive experience, offering advice on safety, routes, and equipment, and in doing so, educated a whole generation of hikers, instilling in them a respect for the wilderness. His online presence became an essential resource for thousands of people planning their Adirondack hikes. Jackson's passion for the wilderness extended beyond his professional duties. He set himself a personal goal of spending the night in each of the 392 public shelters in New York State, and managed to complete about 75% of the task. He kept meticulous records of all his hikes in Excel spreadsheets, tracking the miles traveled, elevation gained, and places visited. He created a unique tradition for his friends, a scout belt made of bottle caps, each symbolizing a specific achievement on a hike. His knowledge was so accurate and extensive that he was asked to proofread and correct the official maps of the Adirondack Mountain Club. Brendan Jackson's significance lay in his unique ability to bridge two worlds. He was a traditional wilderness expert, a man who spent up to 100 nights a year in the woods, and at the same time a modern builder of a digital community. His online activities were not just a hobby, but a continuation of his mission as a guardian. Using digital tools, he democratized knowledge about the wilderness, making it accessible to a much wider audience than any traditional guide or travel book. So let's go back to the day Jackson disappeared. On Sunday morning, June 8th, Brendan Jackson did not check in. On Sunday evening, he did not report that he had finished work. On Monday morning, he still hadn't checked in. This alarming pattern repeated itself day after day. According to his work schedule, he was supposed to make 11 mandatory broadcasts that week, but none of them happened. At the dispatch center in Ray Brook, these missed calls didn't raise any red flags. While the official system remained silent, Jackson's close circle of friends began to worry. His prolonged absence from social media and silence were completely out of character for him. On the evening of Saturday, June 14th, exactly 1 week after his last message, his friend Danielle Carr decided to take action. She started by sending private messages to 3 other rangers to see if they had heard anything about Brendan. When she didn't get an immediate response, she called the Ray Brook Dispatch Center directly at 10:23 p.m. and asked if Jackson had been in contact. The dispatcher's response was a turning point. There was a pause, then she was put on hold, after which she was told that they did not know his status and would pass her information on to his supervisor. This was a shocking confirmation that the system had completely failed. At 11:03 p.m., one of the rangers she had texted called her back and confirmed her worst fears. The last contact with Jackson was on June 7th. The search operation was launched not because of a safety protocol, but thanks to the persistence and concern of a friend. The search began a week late, and its tragic outcome was compounded by the consequences of this delay, which left permanent scars on the hearts of Jackson's family, friends, and colleagues. Early on Sunday morning, June 15th, Father's Day, 2 rangers were dispatched to Duckhole to search for their missing colleague. At around 10 a.m., the rangers discovered Jackson's tent at one of the campsites in Duckhole. Inside, they found his body. The 8-day delay in the warm June weather in the Adirondacks had catastrophic and irreversible consequences that went far beyond the death itself. First, Jackson's body was found in an advanced state of decomposition. This made it impossible to perform a full autopsy to determine the exact cause of death, leaving his family in agonizing uncertainty. Second, the condition of the remains prevented the family from holding an open casket funeral. This cultural and emotional tradition, which allows loved ones to see the face of the deceased one last time, was unavailable to them, adding to their grief. Third, the rangers who discovered and evacuated the body of their friend and colleague were confronted with a deeply traumatic scene. They had to deal with soft tissue, fluids, and odors that linger, which became an unnecessary psychological burden that could have been avoided with a timely response. This case is a stark example of how a systemic failure can have a cascading effect. The initial failure, the lack of response to a missed call, directly led to a series of compounding traumas. It deprived a family of answers about the cause of death, robbed them of a traditional farewell, and caused severe psychological trauma to fellow first responders. Thus, this is not simply a story about a missed call. It is a vivid demonstration of how a single preventable administrative oversight can cause a chain reaction, resulting in numerous and long-lasting human suffering. The damage was not only the death itself, but also the circumstances surrounding its discovery. Doctors were unable to determine the cause of death. The family was deprived of the opportunity to say goodbye to him in a dignified manner, and the rangers who found him suffered deep psychological trauma. Rumors are still circulating about what could have happened to the ranger and why such an experienced man disappeared for 8 days and was then found dead. Unfortunately, there are no details at this time, but this tragedy is not just an accident. It has exposed chronic problems within the Forest Ranger Service: understaffing, disputes over overtime, outdated equipment, and a lack of support for those who regularly deal with trauma and death. Glacier National Park is a rugged and majestic corner of northern Montana, where glaciers, dense forests, and sheer cliffs form a landscape that impresses even the most seasoned explorers. Among park employees, it is known not only for its beauty but also for its unpredictability. In late fall, tourists rarely visit here. The trails are already covered with ice, and the nights become deadly cold. It was at this time, in November 1991, that a disappearance occurred that still baffles National Park Service employees and is considered one of the most disturbing incidents in Glacier's history. Ranger Benjamin Michael Drake, 30, was one of the park's most respected employees. A native of Helena, he had worked for the National Park Service for more than 7 years and had hundreds of hours of solo patrols in remote areas under his belt. Drake was a strong, resilient man with an impeccable reputation. He didn't drink or smoke and always followed instructions to the letter. His colleagues noted that he had a sixth sense for assessing situations, predicting weather changes, and spotting potential dangers. On November 20th, 1991, Drake set out on his last evening patrol of the area around Swift Current Glacier. Despite its relative accessibility, this location was known for its changeable weather conditions and shaded areas where radio signals could be lost. Nevertheless, Benjamin set out on patrol at 3:10 p.m., 3 hours before sunset, and confirmed his location via radio. Approaching the southern part of the old trail, want to check if there are any camps near the forest line? Over the next 40 minutes, Drake made several radio calls, confirming that he was on schedule. However, at 4:03 p.m., he sent a message that would later prove crucial to the investigation. "I see a lone tent at the edge of the forest. It looks unofficial. I'll go check it out." This was his last transmission. 28 minutes later, when Drake did not show up for his next communication session, the ranger on duty tried to contact him. There was no response. The weather that evening began to change rapidly. The temperature dropped sharply, snow began to fall, and a light wind picked up. At 5:10 p.m., a decision was made to send an emergency response team, which by 6 p.m. had already left for the glacier area. When the rescuers arrived at the designated area, it was already completely dark. The snow was getting heavier and visibility was rapidly deteriorating. Nevertheless, traces on the wet ground and a thin layer of fresh snow made it possible to determine that Benjamin had indeed descended to the edge of the forest. His tracks were clear and confident, with no signs of panic or disorderly movement. However, about 50 feet from the location indicated in the report, the tracks suddenly stopped. There was no sign of a fall, a struggle, or a body being moved on the icy ground. Nothing. It was as if the man had simply vanished. The rescuers carefully examined every nearby fold in the terrain, looked under tree stumps, and searched the tree roots, to no avail. The only material evidence of Drake's presence was his radio, found in the grass at the foot of a pine tree. It was turned on. The battery was almost dead, but the transmit button worked. There were no voices on the recording. The radio had not transmitted any messages after 4:03 p.m. The search operation began the next day with additional forces. More than 40 people took part, including ice specialists, trackers, dog handlers, and 3 teams with climbing equipment. They combed every foot of Drake's presumed route, using patrol schedules, weather station records, and employee statements. On the 3rd day of the search, when weather conditions improved slightly, one of the helicopters spotted something unusual. A small object was visible on a rocky outcrop about a mile north of the disappearance site. It was impossible to reach from the ground. It was a sheer wall about 230 feet high. Using a winch, the crew rigged a lift and found a National Park Service cap on the ledge. How this headgear ended up at a height accessible only to climbers without any traces of climbing remains a mystery. The item was dry, with no traces of blood, damage, or other signs of impact. No other clothing, bodies, or signs that anyone had ever been there were found. After Benjamin Drake's cap was found on the ledge, the search operation gained new momentum. The discovery seemed incredible. It was impossible to climb up there without climbing equipment. Neither on that day nor earlier in the season had any groups of climbers been reported in the Swift Current Glacier area. There were no footprints, scratches from equipment, or even traces of fresh snow on the icy rock, as if the object had simply appeared there on its own. One of the investigators present during the recovery later said in his report, "It feels like the cap was placed there from above, as if it fell vertically from a great height, or was carefully placed there by someone but not a human being." The search continued for almost 3 weeks. All accessible areas of the rocks, forest ravines, hidden caves, and areas along the glacial stream were examined. At one point, geophysicists were even called in to scan the soil for underground voids or sinkholes, all to no avail. Benjamin Drake's body was never found, but the case was complicated not only by his disappearance, but also by strange details that began to surface in the following months. First, the radio log, which was listened to later, recorded a short radio message and strange noises. This fragment lasted less than 2 seconds and was recorded with severe interference. Experts confirmed that the frequency matched that of Drake's patrol radio. Second, 6 months later, during a spring patrol of the trails, another ranger, a newcomer named Charles Attridge, reported seeing 2 motionless figures in park uniforms, standing near the tree where Drake had disappeared at dusk. When he called out to them, they turned simultaneously and disappeared into the thick undergrowth. No one was on duty in that area, and the snow was completely untouched. Officials declined to comment on the incident, citing stress and hallucinations on the part of the young employee. Despite the absence of a body, Benjamin Michael Drake was declared dead in 1994 by a federal district court. The most terrifying theory, which is rarely spoken aloud, is connected with the tent he reported on his radio. Neither before nor after Benjamin's disappearance were any tents ever pitched in that area, but he saw it. He went there. He disappeared. And as senior rangers say, if you see someone's camp deep in the woods that isn't marked on the map, don't go near it, even if someone is calling you from inside. Zion National Park is one of the most picturesque corners of southwestern America. Its narrow gorges, sheer walls, and clear streams of the Virgin River attract thousands of tourists every year. Among them are those who know these places not from tourist brochures, people for whom every bend in the canyon is their workplace. One of them is Ranger Paul Richard Harris. In 1990, he had been working for the National Park Service for more than 10 years and knew the Narrows better than anyone else. Paul was a strong, stocky man with a perpetually weather-beaten face, a short beard, and a calm voice. Tourists remember him as a friendly and confident professional. He patrolled the canyons with enviable regularity and was well acquainted with seasonal changes in the water, the movement of rock masses, and the behavior of animals. By the spring of 1990, Paul was living in the town of Springdale, not far from the park, and was considered one of Zion's most experienced rangers. He had repeatedly accompanied tourist groups in difficult conditions, assisted in rescue operations, and trained newcomers to work in the canyons. On May 18, 1990, Paul Harris went on a routine inspection of the southern part of the Narrows, a particularly difficult-to-reach area where a narrow stream flows between almost vertical rock walls. He knew this route like the back of his hand, every boulder, every crevice where water could accumulate after the spring floods. Around noon, a group of tourists from Idaho who were descending the trail by wading noticed Paul standing near one of the large boulders. According to them, he was standing in shallow water, writing something in a notebook, then nodded to them, said hello, and headed behind the boulder, disappearing from view. This was normal behavior for a working ranger, but when they returned to the same spot a minute later to ask for directions to a side stream, they found that Paul was gone. The situation immediately seemed strange. The boulder stood at the base of the canyon. The water was shallow, and the current was moderate. All around were smooth rocks, wet sand, and almost no cover. There were no signs of him leaving. There were no splashes, no voices, no signs that anyone had climbed the rocks or dived into the water. One of the tourists would later say, "It was as if he had stepped behind a rock and simply disappeared. We even walked around him on all sides thinking maybe he had sat down or gone to get his backpack. But he was gone." The tourists reported the strange situation to the nearest patrol station at around 2:45 p.m. Within 2 hours, a search party consisting of park employees, volunteers, and local sheriff's deputies had been assembled. The search continued throughout the night, with flashlights used in the dark. In the morning, dog handlers and several catamarans were brought in, but nothing was found. There was no backpack, no map, no clothes, not even footprints, which are usually clearly visible on wet sand. None of the cameras installed at the entrance and exit of the area recorded Harris reappearing. The water was completely clear, and even divers who searched the area around the boulder found nothing suspicious. The water temperature that day was around 41 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause shock, but not so cold that a body would disappear without a trace. 3 days later, both directions of the river were searched, upstream to the source and downstream to the wider sections of the Narrows. Climbing the slope seemed impossible without climbing equipment, which Paul did not have with him. The forest along the top of the canyon was completely combed through. The accident theory did not hold up. There was no blood, no traces of a fall, no scratches on the rocks. On the fourth day, all the camps were checked, from official campsites to possible makeshift places to spend the night. The result remained the same: 0 clues, 0 traces. Paul's personal belongings were left in his home: his camera, documents, car keys, and spare backpack. He had no intention of leaving. There were no signs that he wanted to take his own life or disappear intentionally. On the contrary, a few days earlier he had ordered new equipment and discussed plans for the summer season with his colleagues. On the 6th day, the search was officially expanded. Civil aviation was called in, and aerial photographs, including satellite images, were checked. A complete search of all side canyons, inconspicuous crevices, and areas with dense vegetation was conducted. Nothing. This was not just a disappearance, it was a disappearance under impossible conditions. That's how one of the park's senior employees, Captain Michael Robertson, who had worked in Zion since the 1970s, put it. Even if he left, he didn't have time to leave. Even if he dove, where? Even if he climbed up the wall, how? None of it adds up. By May 1991, a year after his disappearance, the case was closed as a disappearance without a trace under unknown circumstances. Understanding the wilderness and human vulnerability. Brendan Jackson, Benjamin Drake, and Paul Harris were not novices, but masters of their craft. Men whose lives were dedicated to protecting and studying America's most rugged landscapes. Their disappearance exposed not only the fragility of the systems designed to support them, but something more disturbing: an inexplicable force lurking in the depths of forests, canyons, and glaciers. Were these fatal accidents, systemic failures, or something beyond our understanding? In comments on forums from the ADK forum to Reddit, users continue to discuss these cases, putting forward theories ranging from bears and landslides to supernatural forces or mysterious tents beckoning to nowhere. One thing is clear: these stories linger in our minds. They remind us that even in the age of technology and maps, the wilderness has secrets to hide. And perhaps some of those secrets are better left untold. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe together we can get closer to the truth. Three rangers have gone missing in the impenetrable forests and steep slopes of the Cascade Mountains and Adirondacks, and their stories are like pages from a thriller that will send shivers down your spine. One left his backpack, dry as if he hadn't seen rain, in the middle of the wet forest. Another left a blood-stained t-shirt tucked under the roots of a fallen tree, with no sign of his body. The third, the most experienced of the three, was found wedged in a narrow crevice, his boots neatly removed and a sock clenched in his fist, as if he knew he was leaving his last clue. What took these people? Chance, nature, or something sinister lurking in the shadows of the mountains? May 9th, 1984, a national park located in the northern part of the Cascade Mountains, Washington. It was a damp day. A fine, annoying rain had been falling since morning, turning into a steady downpour in places. Park Ranger Robert Summers, a 33-year-old employee with nearly a decade of experience, was making his standard patrol along the southeastern border of the park. His route took him along old logging roads, rocky trails, and marshy areas. It was an easy route, more of a check on secluded tourist parking areas than a real inspection. At around 2:40 p.m., he made his last contact, reporting that he was checking the remote Old Creekside campsite, one of the least used areas, usually visited only by experienced solo hikers. The connection was stable, his voice calm. After that, there was no signal, no message, nothing. When he did not show up at the base in the evening, those on duty decided that the delay was caused by bad weather or a broken radio. It was not until the next morning that it became clear Summers was missing, and from that moment on, one of the most disturbing search operations in the park's history began, with details that remain unexplained to this day. On the morning of May 10th, the first search party arrived at the park. It included Robert's colleagues, security guards, and volunteer rescuers. The weather was terrible. The forest was saturated with moisture, the trails were muddy, and visibility was poor. Nevertheless, by the end of the first day, they managed to find some clues. On the trail where Summers was supposed to have walked, they discovered fresh footprints of his boots, characteristic deep tread marks of a service model. The tracks led to a low area along a stream and then disappeared on a dry patch under some pine trees. There were no signs of a struggle or other people's footprints, only his footsteps ending abruptly at the foot of a tree. 6 days later, on May 15th, a volunteer found Summers' backpack. And that's when things started to get strange. The backpack was standing upright, leaning against a thin, mossy tree a few miles from where his tracks had last been seen. The ground around it was wet and puddled, but the backpack itself was dry. Even the dust on the fasteners had not been washed away. This was perplexing. It had been raining for 6 days. The only way it could have stayed so dry was if it had been sheltered, but there were no rocks, caves, or shelters nearby. Moreover, inside the backpack were a full ration of food, a neatly folded first aid kit, a flashlight, a raincoat, and even a bag of dry socks. Everything was in perfect condition, as if someone had put it there just now, not 6 days ago. And one more thing, there wasn't a single speck of dirt on the backpack, no signs of it being dragged, no animal tracks, not a single one. It just stood there perfectly straight, as if someone had put it down and walked away. The search continued for several more days. Dog handlers were brought in, and the search area was expanded to dozens of square miles. No results, no clothes, no traces, no body. On May 24th, 2 weeks after the disappearance, another event occurred that rescuers still remember with a shudder. One of the volunteers, a local forester named Jack McCauley, was exploring the northern slope a mile and a half from where the backpack had been found. Strong winds had been blowing in the area, and several large fir trees had been knocked down by the storm. Among the uprooted tree roots, he noticed a piece of fabric stuck between the roots. It was a t-shirt typical of park rangers. The t-shirt was dirty with blood stains, but it wasn't torn. The fabric looked as if it had been used to wipe hands. The blood was smeared as if from palms, not splashes or cuts. There were no other objects, no signs of a body, no animals. Just an uprooted tree, and under the roots his t-shirt, as if someone had hidden it there, or as if it had fallen there from above, which was just as strange. The tree had been felled recently. The dog that had been participating in the search suddenly refused to go any further. It growled, pressed itself to the ground, and turned back with a yelp. This was the only time during the entire search that a service animal had shown a panic reaction. After finding the blood-stained t-shirt under the roots of the uprooted tree, the search intensified. The area was combed in a spiral pattern, hoping that the body might be nearby. But neither the dogs, nor the drones, nor the people could find anything. No clothing, no remains, no signs of a struggle, no human scent. The incident with the dog was not documented in the official reports. Only in the private notes of one of the rangers, Ben Toller, is it later mentioned. After finding the t-shirt, the dog's behavior changed dramatically. Before that, it had been following the trail confidently, but where the fabric was found, it growled, then lay down and refused to move. We had to drag it away. The next day, the animal refused to get out of the car. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout the search, several dogs behaved strangely. They strayed off course, froze, and howled. Officially, these reactions were explained by fatigue. Still, people in the group said otherwise. There was something wrong in that forest. The t-shirt was sent to the Franklin County Police Department laboratory. Blood tests confirmed that it was type A+, matching Robert's blood type. The fabric also showed traces of dirt, pine pollen, and small wood fibers. indicating that the t-shirt had been placed there after the tree fell, not before. This ruled out the theory that Summers had died under the tree. It had fallen later. Experts also noted the nature of the stains. The blood was smeared, as if wiped away. There were heavy abrasions on the armpits and collar, as if from wear and tear. But there were no tears, no direct signs of injury, no knife wounds, no bullet wounds, no signs of dragging. This was puzzling. The t-shirt was stained with blood, but not damaged. It seemed that it was not his blood, or that he was not wearing it when he was injured. At an emergency meeting of the Park Service and the police, the leading theories for Robert Summers' disappearance were discussed. Death from hypothermia and disorientation was ruled out. His backpack, containing a complete ration, was found in an accessible place, dry and tidy, and it was unclear why he would have abandoned it. An animal attack was not confirmed. There were no pieces of clothing, signs of a struggle, or remains. Murder was considered possible, but there were no leads on a suspect, no body, no weapon, and no signs of dragging or a struggle. The hypothesis of a hidden suicide seemed unconvincing. Summers was in stable condition, loved his job, had no mental disorders, and why would he leave his backpack with food and a first aid kit if he planned to die? In the end, the report was filed as missing under unknown circumstances, without conclusions or explanations. Interviews with park employees revealed that on the morning of May 9, 1984, Summers set out on a routine patrol of the northern slope, which was not considered dangerous. He left alone as usual and remained in contact until lunchtime. The last radio message at 1:46 p.m. said, "Checking the rock bridge. Everything is quiet." After that, communication was lost, and he did not return to base camp. On the morning of May 10th, his absence was noticed and a search began, but due to an oversight, no one recorded his route on the map. Summers often relied on his intuition, knowing the forest like the back of his hand, which became a problem. No one knew where he had gone after noon. The search was called off in early June 1984, with no body or new traces found. Summers' remains were never found. The family held a memorial service without a coffin, and he was formally declared dead as a result of an accident. Robert's brother, Greg Summers, rejected this wording, saying, "This was not an accident, it was something else. My brother knew that forest. He wouldn't have died from rain or cold. He wouldn't have left his backpack behind. And damn it, who wipes blood on a t-shirt and hides it under a tree?" The morning of June 15th was quiet in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, in the High Peaks region. For the search party of forest rangers, the silence was ominous. Their path laid a duck hole, a remote and wild place located more than 7 miles from the nearest road at Upper Works. This was not just a point on a map, but a symbol of the Adirondacks' changing nature. Once upon a time, a beautiful lake existed here, created by a dam. However, in 2011, Hurricane Irene destroyed it, causing the water to recede and leaving behind only a broad meadow crossed by a stream. It was in this secluded spot, on a designated camping site, that a lone tent stood. Approaching it, the rangers made a gruesome discovery. Inside was the body of their colleague, 42-year-old Assistant Forest Ranger Martin Benjamin Lewis. He had been dead for 8 days, and his body was in an advanced state of decomposition. An initial examination revealed no signs of violence, struggle, or animal attack. The weather on the days of his disappearance had not been extreme. The mystery of his death was compounded by one strange detail. The tent was partially covered with branches and leaves. Was this his last feverish act in an attempt to keep warm or find shelter? Or was it simply the result of 8 days spent under the canopy of the forest? The answer to this question, like many others, remains a mystery in Duck Hole. The place where Martin was found is itself a powerful and tragic symbol. In the past, it was the site of a Department of Environmental Protection ranger station, an outpost of law and order in the wilderness. By the time of the tragedy, the station had long been abandoned, and the area had returned to its pristine, wild state. The physical absence of a ranger station at the very spot where one of its own died due to an apparent failure of the surveillance system became a bitter metaphor. The system that was supposed to protect him had failed, leaving him alone in the very wilderness he loved and served. To understand the full depth of the tragedy, you need to know who Martin Benjamin Lewis was. He wasn't just a DC employee, he was the embodiment of the Adirondack spirit. Born on Easter Sunday in 1983, Brendan was fascinated by nature from an early age, drawing maps of the woods behind his house. His passion led him to Paul Smith's College, and then to the College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where he earned his master's degree. Since 2008, he has returned each year for seasonal work as a forest ranger assistant, serving in the most visited and remote corners of the park. Friends and colleagues described him as calm, a natural leader, and perhaps the most knowledgeable person in the room. His preparation was legendary. Even for a short walk, he would take a full backpack with him, a first aid kit, 2 sets of maps, a compass, communication devices, and a supply of food. It is this meticulousness that makes his lonely and inexplicable death even more paradoxical. Martin lived at the intersection of 2 worlds. He was an avid hiker who had set himself the goal of spending the night in each of the state's 392 official shelters. At the time of his death, he had completed about 75% of that journey, spending up to 100 nights a year hiking. At the same time, he was a geek who loved video games. His Steam collection included about 2,000 games, and kept meticulous Excel spreadsheets tracking his hikes, miles traveled, elevation gained, places visited. This duality was also evident in his online life. Under the nickname Disappearances on forums dedicated to the Adirondacks, he was a respected voice, sharing his knowledge about safety and wildlife conservation. He was so well known that hikers who met him on the trail recognized him and felt like they had met a celebrity. And therein lies another tragic paradox. A man so well known and visible to the entire hiking community was completely invisible to his own employer. His popularity in the informal network of hikers who admired him contrasts sharply with the failure of the official system that was supposed to monitor him. While hundreds of people were reading his posts on forums, the system responsible for his life did not notice his deafening silence for 8 days. What happened to Martin on that tragic day? The evening of June 7th. Martin Benjamin Lewis was on a multi-day patrol in the western part of the High Peaks. At 7:22 p.m., he last communicated with the Central Dispatch Center in Ray Brook. His message was short and standard. He had set up camp at Duck Hole and was completing his field duty. These words are key to understanding what happened next. It didn't mean the end of his shift or that he was heading home. This status was an official protocol to inform dispatch that an employee was still working in a remote area as part of their job. More importantly, this status meant that dispatch should expect him to check in the next morning to resume patrolling. It wasn't just a report, but the start of a safety protocol that was completely ignored in the days that followed. What happened next became the subject of an investigation initiated not by the agency but by Martin's friends. Sunday morning, June 8th, came and went without a radio call from Martin. Then Sunday evening passed, Monday morning and evening, and so on. According to his work schedule and standard procedures, Martin Benjamin Lewis missed 11 mandatory communication sessions before his friends raised the alarm. 11 times, the system designed to keep him safe failed. None of the missed calls triggered an alarm. The alarm was raised not in the control room, but among his close friends. On Saturday, June 14th, a week after the last contact, his girlfriend Danielle Carr, concerned about the long silence, took action. At around 10 p.m., she sent private messages to 3 rangers, mutual acquaintances. At 10:23 p.m., she called the dispatch service in Raybrook directly and asked if Martin had been in contact. After a pause and being kept on hold, she was told that they didn't know and that her information would be passed on to his supervisor. Only after this external push, initiated by a civilian, was an official search operation organized. This failure was not just human error. It was compounded by systemic and technological regression. As revealed in a petition created by Martin's friends, the Rangers' management had previously had software to track employees. Still, it had been discontinued several years ago. The most shocking thing is that, according to his friends, Martin Benjamin Lewis's name often appeared in internal emails as an example of why such technology is vital for employees working in remote areas. The agency was aware of the existing vulnerability and the associated risk, yet it took no action. Based on this, no one searched for the Ranger for 8 days. The silence of the wilderness can be deceptive. It hides not only beauty, but also the fragility of human life, even if that life belongs to someone who knows nature like the back of their hand. The death of an experienced ranger like Martin Benjamin Lewis in his own tent, without a trace of a struggle, a gunshot, or an animal attack, is not a scene from a crime thriller. It is a quiet tragedy, the answer to which lies not in malicious intent but in human biology, and, more disturbingly, in systemic negligence. But the reason why he disappeared and was later found without any signs of violence leaves more questions than answers. Mountains do not forgive weakness, but they value experience. They can be a source of inspiration and a deadly trap, often at the same time. For 44-year-old Douglas Vane, a senior ranger at a national park, the mountains were not just a job, they were his essence. 20 years of service had turned him into a living legend, a man who knew every ridge and every trail, who read the signs of nature as easily as we read a book. His colleagues called him a rock, the most reliable person to take on the most challenging route. And that is precisely why what happened on July 13, 1985, still defies logical explanation. That Saturday morning was clear and calm, perfect weather for patrolling. Douglas, or Doug as his friends called him, was up before dawn. It was his usual routine, a quick breakfast, a thorough check of his equipment, a goodbye kiss from his wife Sarah, and a promise to be back for dinner. His task for the day was to inspect the northern route to Sanderson Pass. After recent storms, the trail could be dangerous, and who better than Wayne to assess its condition? At 7:30 a.m., he logged his departure at the central station. His backpack contained the standard time-tested kit, a first aid kit, a day's supply of food and water, a raincoat, a map, a compass, and a radio. Nothing superfluous, Douglas was a master of efficiency. At 9:17 a.m., his voice came over the dispatch radio. The sound was clear and calm, with only a slight interference from the mountain wind. Central, this is Ranger 3. I'm approaching Devil's Cornice. The trail is partially washed out and there's a fresh landslide. It looks unstable, but passable. The dispatcher replied, Roger, Ranger 3. Do you recommend temporarily closing the route? Douglas's reply was the last words anyone ever heard from him. Not yet. I'll assess the damage and report back. I'll go around the edge. There's a ledge there. Over and out. The following communication session was scheduled for noon. At midday, the radio was silent. The dispatcher called him every 15 minutes. At first, this did not cause panic. Interference in the mountains was common, but when Doug did not come on the radio at 1 p.m., an alarm spread through the station. Doug was the epitome of punctuality. Missing a communication session was tantamount to an emergency for him. At 2 p.m., a search operation was officially launched. At first, 2 rangers set out along his route. By evening, when it became clear that this was serious, dozens of volunteers, dog handlers, and rescuers from neighboring counties joined the search. But nature seemed to be against them. On Saturday night, a powerful rainstorm hit the pass and lasted for almost 5 hours. The water washed away all possible traces, turning the search into a guessing game. Hope faded with every hour, with every day. On the 5th day, in the morning of July 18th, when many were already preparing for the worst, search helicopter pilot Bob Gallagher noticed something strange. On a secluded rocky ledge, far from the main trail, he saw a pair of hiking boots. They were not scattered, but stood neatly side by side, as if their owner had sat down to rest. Hovering over the spot, the pilot and his observer spotted a narrow vertical crack in the rock next to the boots, almost invisible from the ground. Peering into the darkness, they saw a motionless body. It was Douglas Wine. The rescue team that descended onto the ledge was confronted with a scene that defied all notions of mountain accidents. Imagine the picture. Douglas's body was in a narrow, nearly 2-foot wide and nearly 13-foot deep crevice. He was stuck in an upright position. A preliminary examination revealed no injuries typical of a fall from a height. No fractures, no bruises, no skull damage. It was as if he had not fallen, but had been carefully placed inside. Second detail, his clothes were completely dry. And this was after a heavy downpour a few days earlier. This could only mean one thing. At the time of the rain, Vane was in some kind of shelter. But where? And how did he end up in the crevice afterwards, still dry? The third and most peculiar detail was his boots. Heavy, sturdy hiking boots with untied laces were standing on the very edge of the crevice. They had not been thrown off in a panic, but deliberately placed there. Why would an experienced ranger take off his shoes on a dangerous rock ledge? When rescuers recovered the body, they found Douglas's right hand clenched tightly into a fist. Unclenching his fingers, they found a tightly crumpled sock inside, taken from his own foot. But that wasn't all. Wayne's backpack was found 400 yards, almost 1,200 feet, up the slope from the scene of the tragedy. It was just lying on the moss as if it had been carefully placed there. Inside was all his gear: untouched food, a water canteen, a first aid kit, and a silent radio. A person in trouble instinctively holds on to their backpack, their lifeline. Why did Douglas leave it so far away and in the opposite direction from the descent? The official investigation came to a complete standstill. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia or excessive exposure to cold. But how could this be explained? Dry clothes, no signs of a fall, neatly placed shoes, and a backpack hundreds of feet from the body. Investigators considered one theory after another. An accident involving so-called paradoxical undressing? This is a well-known phenomenon where, in the final stages of hypothermia, a person feels a false rush of heat and begins to remove their clothes. This could explain the boots and socks, but not the dry clothes or the position of the backpack. A sudden heart attack or stroke? Perhaps he felt ill, sat down, took off his boots. But the autopsy showed no heart or brain abnormalities. And again, that damn backpack. Crime? Someone could have attacked Vana and staged this absurd scene to cover their tracks. But there was no motive, no clues, no signs of a struggle. Douglas was a man who had no enemies. The case was closed with the vague wording, "Death due to an accident under unclear circumstances." But for those who knew Doug Wayne, this story became an open wound, an eternal question with no answer. What drove one of America's most experienced rangers to commit this series of inexplicable acts before his death? What does the sock clenched in his fist as his last clue mean? And what force or event compelled him to leave his gear behind and find his end in a quiet, hidden crevice? The mountains remain silent, and the mystery of Ranger Wayne's last journey seems likely to remain one of the darkest mysteries of the wilderness. That's all for now, friends. Write your thoughts in the comments, like and share the video with your friends if you enjoyed it, and see you soon.